Clive Derby-Lewis died on the 3rd of November 2016. He was released on medical parole in the year 2015 after having spent 22 years in prison for his involvement with the killing of Chris Hani, who was the leader of the South African Communist Party and also the commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. After his release from prison, Derby-Lewis was not allowed to speak to any media, and he was not allowed to leave his house for that matter. We were, however, to secure an exclusive interview with him, which is the only interview that he has done since his release from prison. After Derby-Lewis's death, it was said that he took all his secrets with him to the grave. But during our 1 hour long interview with him, he spoke extensively about his life, about his involvement with politics and his experiences during the early 90s, the killing of Chris Hani, his battle with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, his years in prison and the assassination attempts on his life, his battle for medical parole, and his experience after having been released from prison. Clive Derby-Lewis, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Let's jump right into the interview. And the first question I want to ask you is, I think the big important question is, why did you kill Chris Hani?
Chris Hani was a hardline communist who was determined at all costs, even to laying the country to waste, to achieve his political aims. He was a radical. He was uncontrollable by the ANC hired authorities. He was a man who targeted civilians in preference to military targets. And as far as we were concerned, he was public enemy number one.
Well, we'll delve into the Chris Hani topic a bit later in the interview, but if we take it a step back, you were, I think, about 12 years old in 1948 when the National Party took over. How did the politics of South Africa and of the National Party in particular influence you in growing up?
Well, I lived right through the so-called apartheid era. I was very aware of what was going on because my father encouraged me to read newspapers at a young age. So I knew it was happening with the war. And I observed that there was a big influx of African people from the rural areas into the cities looking for work, an uncontrollable wave of people. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We talk about people who were totally illiterate. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. And all of a sudden, these were landed on urban areas. And it was quite clear from that situation that the National Party, who was the government in 1948, had to do something to ensure control, because if you study the history of South Africa, you will see that before 1948, before the National Party took power, there were a number of what people refer to as apartheid laws already in operation. They were in operation to ensure good order in the country and to assure that there is no conflict between the various racial groups.
You've recently been released from prison. You are currently out on medical parole. How is your health at the moment?
So I'm very grateful to Almighty God for that, but I really have a reasonable quality of life today. My lung cancer is in remission, and I'm quite comfortable.
I've seen a picture of you and Lieutenant General W.R. van der Riet awarding you with a medal. Perhaps if you can just explain to us what that was about.
Well, I served for many years in the citizen force. I eventually ended up as commanding officer of the Witwatersrand Rifles Regiment, and that medal that General van der Riet was pinning on my chest was for efficient and meritorious service.
And you were the youngest commander of that regiment, is that correct?
And I believe I'm still classified as the youngest ever.
Um, you were involved with the National Party at one stage, and then there was a time when you left the National Party and you joined the Conservative Party. So what was the reason? Why did you join the National Party initially, and what made you leave the National Party and join the Conservative Party in 1982, I presume?
I've always been politically aware. At school, I decided that I wanted to make some sort of a contribution as an English speaker, because I criticized the English-speaking community for not being sufficiently involved in the government sector of South Africa. So I decided to try and do something about it. When I left school, I did military training. I did voluntary training for a period of 19 years. And during that period, I met a gentleman by the name of Charles Stallard. He was a colonel of the British Army in his own right. He was also an advocate. He was a member of Parliament at one stage for Roodepoort, and he was a member of Smuts's coalition government in 1940, in the 40s. He had a lot to do with my getting involved in politics, because he was of the opinion that I should get involved because South Africa needed people like me in politics. And when I decided eventually to stop my military career, I went to him for advice, and he told me exactly how to get involved in politics. And he told me outright, he said, don't waste your time with these other little parties. Go straight for the National Party and get involved there and make a difference.
As an English-speaking South African, would you say, especially within the politics of the Conservative Party, did that put you in an advantageous or a disadvantageous position?
Well, I mean, obviously it was advantageous because of my fluency in English. I was eventually given the position of PR for the Conservative Party, and handled most of the television interviews from overseas media who inquired about the Conservative Party policy. But the English-speaking story, of course, is quite interesting. I grew up as an English speaker, and it was only when I went to Parliament that I discovered that our branch of the family was the only English-speaking branch, and that we were all actually Afrikaners.
Obviously, a person can have many identities. You can be a Afrikaans-speaking person, or you can be a white South African, or you can be a South African. Which identity of yours would you say do you hold most dear? Would you describe yourself as an Afrikaner, for example?
I would describe myself as an Afrikaner in the terms of General Hertzog's definition. General Herzog said that anyone who puts South Africa first, English or Afrikaans speaking, is a South African, is an Afrikaner. And based on that, I devoted almost my full political life towards promoting that image, and also towards convincing English speakers that they were Afrikaners and they shouldn't be upset if people spoke about the future of their Afrikaner because they were included. In fact, it was quite interesting that I eventually agreed, or got the people to agree, that instead of calling ourselves a folk, which is a concept which people don't understand, we should call ourselves a tribe, because we are the white tribe of Africa.
You were opposed to the releasing of Nelson Mandela in 1990. What was the reason therefore?
Well, I was certainly opposed. The most important reason was that he refused to repudiate or disassociate himself from violence. With an attitude like that, you couldn't release the man. I mean, he had to renounce violence.
But wouldn't you say that apartheid was dead in any case, and that certain changes had to be made?
Changes in what regard?
Political reforms, releasing Mandela, unbanning the ANC.
You know, the amazing thing about this whole story is that political reforms were already introduced by the National Party years before under Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. The policy of separate development, which the media mischievously branded apartheid with the accent on the HAT, hate, That was a policy which was aimed at developing the various African tribes to the stage that they were able to competently govern themselves. I mean, that political reform is unbeatable in world terms. In fact, what would eventually have happened in South Africa is we would have had something similar to the European Union, where we had self-governing sovereign states all cooperating for the benefit of everyone.
So if the concept was self-determination and separate development, what went wrong? Why did the system not work at the end of the day?
Well, you know, the system did work. In fact, when there was a survey done in 1978, just before P.W. Botha announced that it wasn't working, and it was discovered that at that stage, an average of 72% of all of the people of the various tribes were either resident within their traditional territories or on the outskirts, attracted by the factory employment and whatever which was available. So 72%, I believe, is a success story.
Yes. So after the removal of the declaration that the ANC was an illegal organization and the release of Mandela, the negotiation started, and it quickly became a bilateral process between the National Party and the ANC, the negotiations for a new South Africa and a new constitution. But you were involved in the leadership of the Conservative Party at the time, but the Conservative Party boycotted the negotiations. Do you believe that this was a fruitful strategy?
Well, first of all, I think we must clarify the situation regarding the negotiations. There were already subtle negotiations going on within the National Party long before 1990. In fact, I know that, for example, the Broederbond chairman, P. De Lange, had a meeting in London with prominent leaders of the ANC. There were also other academics, and Pitt Miller of now Media 24, he was the first guy who started talking to the ANC. The Democratic or the Progressive Federal Party also had their meetings with the ANC negotiating. You know, at one stage, Dr. Connie Mulder was thrown out of Parliament because he allegedly lied to Parliament about the establishment of the Citizen newspaper. Now, when I was in Parliament, I got there in 87. In 88, I used to get tips from anonymous people, which I presumed were national intelligence or security branch guys, but really good information against the government. And I got a call one day to say that the government were in discussions with the ANC, secret discussions. Now, in 1987, the National Party really took the wind out of the Prog Party, PFP's sails, because of their meetings in Dakar with the ANC. They roasted them with that. And I now have this information in 1988 that the National Party cabinet ministers are talking to the ANC. Now, the only way I can confirm this is through a question, put it on the order paper. So I put the question to P.W. Botha as the president, are you or any of your cabinet ministers holding discussions with any leading members of the ANC? The answer came back, no. Then I sent a question to each minister individually. Are you engaged in discussions with prominent members of the ANC? And the answer came back, no. Now, I went to the caucus for that when I got the initial information, and I got a mandate to handle the matter. And I thought, oh, I've got to find, you can't ask the same question twice. So I had to find a wording which would give me access to a direct answer, where they would have to give me an answer, yes or no, that they were. And I put the question in the order paper. And the next thing, I get a call from Frank LaRue, the chief whip, go to his office. He says, listen, he says, I've just come back from talking to Kobe Kutsia. As you know, he was a cabinet minister, he was Minister of Justice at that stage. He said, and that question that you asked about discussions with the ANC, you're not going to get a satisfactory answer. I said, oh, why not? No, he said, well, we've agreed. Kirby put it to me very clearly that answering that question of yours would not be in the national interest. And so he's not going to give you your answer. And I assured him that you wouldn't give you any follow-up questions on that question. And I said, okay, who gave you that right? I said, I was mandated by the caucus. No, he said, you know, national interest and so on, it takes priority over anything. And I had him lambasted at the following caucus meeting because, I mean, he had no right to do that. And in fact, he saved the National Party because, I mean, you can imagine what would have happened if it came out in 1988 that the National Party, contrary to what they said about the the PROGS, PFP, meeting with the ANC, were doing exactly the same thing. And it would have brought them down in 1989. But the important part of the National Party negotiations, that I believed that they were negotiating with the ANC to ensure their future position in a black-ruled South Africa.
So, putting it that way, do you believe that the National Party was dishonest in the way it communicated to its constituency?
They were totally dishonest. In fact, de Klerk himself was dishonest to his own constituency, because that announcement that he made releasing Mandela and unbanning the Communist Party and the ANC, he made on his own. He didn't even discuss the matter with his caucus before he did it, which is the so-called democratic process. So he had already taken dictatorial rights and decided for the people. He then, of course, pulled a complete swindle with the 1992 referendum, when he got such a thumping in Potchefstroom and previous to that in Virginia and the Free State. He was morally obliged to call an election because it was clear at that stage that the electorate had rejected the National Party. Instead of that, he called a referendum. He concocted a very vague question which people encouraged people to vote yes. They threatened people with their jobs. They threatened that sport wouldn't take place in South Africa anymore. The whole thing was based on threats to intimidate the voter into voting yes. And in spite of that, there was still a considerable percentage of people who voted no. In fact, if you check the figures of voting, you will find that, for example, in the region controlled by P.W. Botha, 15 constituencies, that they had a 105% vote, which I'm sure you'll agree with me is quite ridiculous. Yeah, I think the major mistake was entering and participating in the referendum. You know that we wanted an election, and we knew that we could win an election. The figures in Potchefstroom and Virginia indicated this. So we had to obviously take a decision. Now, at that stage, there was talk of a possible referendum, and the executive of the General Council had already said, we're not participating. And before the referendum was announced, you know, the guys, when they've got nothing to do at Parliament, they go back to their constituencies to see what's going on and so on. And this particular week, the chief whip of the CP, Frank LaRue, instructed Koos van der Merwe, who was the whip on duty, that should there be any announcement regarding the referendum, he must call all of the guys back to Parliament so that we could discuss it in caucus, which he never did. So the announcement was made. We had a caucus meeting on the Thursday, and unfortunately, Ferdy Hartzenberg wasn't there as chairman. He was replaced by Tom Langley, and we only had 24 of the 44 caucus members present. The vast majority of the others who were not there would certainly not have voted for participation in the referendum. But when somebody stood up, I don't remember who, and said, we must debate this and we must take a vote, Tom Langley agreed. He approved it as chairman of the meeting. It came to the vote, and it was 12 for and 12 against. And then I think that Dr. Andries Strenicht made the biggest mistake of his political career and the CP's biggest mistake. He said, because he didn't want to be responsible for breaking up the Afrikaner unity, he would also vote in support of the participation. And so we went to participate. Now the problem with participating, of course, was that had we not participated, the democratic movement would not have participated either. There would have been nothing at stake. But when we decided to go into it, they decided that to keep us out, to kill the no vote, they would vote with the National Party. And I believe that had we not participated, de Klerk would have battled to get a 30% support for his right to continue to have the referendum.
So let's talk about that by-election of Potchefstroom in Potchefstroom from 1992, which led to this referendum where white South Africans had to vote whether the National Party should continue with negotiations or not.
Yeah.
Would you agree if I were to say that by-election indicated a significant shift in politics in South Africa, leaning towards the Conservative Party away from the National Party?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, the political pundits were saying that the result in Potchefstroom indicated that at that stage 56.8% of South Africans would support the Conservative Party in a general election.
And then there's another question about that election is that I'd like your opinion on, if whether you believe that sort of indicated a degree of inconsistency within the Conservative Party, because the person who was the candidate in that election was an office bearer of the Conservative Party, and in 1982 there was a similar election in Germiston. Maybe you can just explain that comparison. And do you believe that there was an inconsistency?
Yes, well, as far as I was concerned, there was, because I was personally involved. In 1982, shortly after the Conservative Party was established in March, there was a by-election in Germiston district in August of that year. The local community wanted me to be the candidate. The General Secretary at that stage was a man by the name of R.C. van Wyk. And I think he was of the old school National Party who really didn't trust English speakers. And so, of course, he vetoed my candidacy in Germiston district because I was actually part-time working for the Conservative Party. With Andries Beyers, who was the General Secretary, was a full-time employee, and yet he was approved as the candidate for Potchefstroom. So I think there were certain discrepancies there.
Dr. Andries Strenicht was the leader of the Conservative Party, and he passed away in 1993, if I recall, and you got to know him quite closely. What was your view on him as an individual?
Well, I've always admired Dr. Strenicht and respected him. In the first place, Andries Strenicht was a politician who had no skeletons in his cupboard. He was untouchable, and that is why the media detested him so much, because they couldn't come up with some other scandal. He was a leader respected by everyone in the party. He led through example. I believe that, in fact, he was a bit too decent, because at one stage I had information of F.W. de Klerk's affair with the Greek lady that he subsequently divorced his wife for. And I wanted to raise the matter in Parliament because I believed that it could have brought about de Klerk's downfall. And Strenicht's answer to me was, that's not our style, Clive, leave it.
He died, as I said, in 1993 under slightly suspicious circumstances, and there are some who believe that he was murdered, that he didn't die from a heart attack. Is that your view as well?
Well, you know, I'm not sure, because at that stage I was in prison, But I must mention that Dr. Connie Mulder also went to that same hospital for treatment when he was, as far as I was concerned, fine. Dr. Connie and I were personal friends, and we had a close relationship. And he was getting better. His hair was growing back after the chemo, and he looked fit, and he was keeping fit. And he suddenly was called for a checkup at the same hospital that Dr. Journeys was taken up, and he never came out of the hospital. And then Dr. Journeys, under similar circumstances, okay, he had a heart attack, but he was very fit, I know, because we used to sometimes train together in the grounds of Acacia Park. And for him to suffer a sudden death like that, it certainly leaves suspicions.
Don't you think perhaps maybe the whole story with Chris Hani and your conviction might have played a role, or do you think there were other factors?
I don't know. You know, that's something which will always, I think, puzzle a lot of people, but I don't think that had any effect on it.
You were particularly involved also with the internationalizing the cause of the Conservative Party, and as you said earlier, you were the PRO as well. But the impression that I get was that there was broad consensus among the world that apartheid was already on the way out. Do you think you were able to sell or to market the position of the Conservative Party, and did you make any progress in this regard?
Well, yes, you know, the most important reason for our visit was to inform the business community overseas what our policy was. And we had a final interview with the president of the Union Bank of Switzerland. And after Dr. Journey spoke to him and outlined our policy and whatever, he said to this president, he said, "What would your feeling be if the Conservative Party became the government in South Africa?" And the president's answer was a simple one. He said, "We only look for one thing in a country, and that is stability. If there's stability, we will invest, because we know in South Africa we can make good benefits out of our investments. So if you ensure stability, that's all we want. We don't mind what your policy is."
And how would a Conservative Party government have been different than a National Party government? Would it implement the same policies, or would there be changes in the way the system was implemented?
Well, you know that the policy of separate development was so successful that there were 4 self-governing territories who had total sovereignty finally. It was the Transkei, the Ciskei, Venda, and Bophuthatswana. Bophuthatswana was the surprise of all, because those Tswanas people took it so seriously that within a period of something like 3 or 4 years, they became an exporter of agricultural products, which made them one of 3 African states, the other 2 being South Africa and Botswana, who were actually able to export agricultural products. So it was a success story. The Venda government were very successful with their tourism. The Ciskei government were very successful in effecting industrial development. The only flop was the Transkei, and that was because those people were too arrogant to do anything themselves. They just sat there and reaped the benefit of massive financial injections from the National Party government and did very little to develop their people.
So, with the benefit of hindsight, and from a strategic perspective, what would you say, because at the end of the day, the Conservative Party did not succeed in taking over the government. So what would you say were the biggest mistakes that the Conservative Party made?
Well, the biggest mistake we made was trusting de Klerk. I mean, we expected him to behave like an honorable person, which he had no intention of doing. He was determined to betray us. All of those negotiations and discussions that they had illegally, and I almost exposed that at one stage with Nelson Mandela and company, they were all aimed at securing their own position in the future with a black-dominated government. And the fact that, as you know, after 1994, they became part of the combined government confirms what my suspicions were. But I actually in 1990 issued a information pamphlet in my constituency in Krugersdorp under the heading of Oorgawe, in other words, surrender. And I outlined the process that I believed was going to be followed by the National Party government in their determination to betray us. And with a few date problems, what I forecast exactly took place.
Why particularly Chris Hani? Why not Nelson Mandela?
That could render South Africa ungovernable. At that stage, I still wasn't convinced that it was the right thing to do. And this is something which didn't come out generally